The quantum probability sensors of the Tsel-Negan observation ship predictive paradigm hummed with anticipation as it approached the small blue-green planet designated X742 Theta. Commander Zornak's tentacle-like appendages moved with practiced precision across the holographic interface, each movement a testament to millennia of computational evolution. Initiating primary scan, Zornak announced to the bridge crew, his voice a precise modulation of harmonics that translated perfectly across neural communication networks. The ship represented the pinnacle of the Tsel-Negan Confederation's technological achievement, a living vessel capable of processing quintillions of potential outcomes in microseconds. What they didn't know was that humanity was already watching. Sarah Chen sat in a converted shipping container on the outskirts of the Atacama Desert, surrounded by a chaotic array of monitors, custom-built servers, and enough electronic equipment to make a NASA engineer weep with joy or despair. Her workspace looked like the love child of a tech startup, and a junkyard, with cables snaking across makeshift workstations and half-eaten protein bars serving as impromptu paperweights. She had been tracking the incoming alien vessel for precisely 72 hours, 14 minutes, and 23 seconds. "Come on, you beautiful bastards," Sarah muttered, her fingers dancing across multiple keyboards. Her prosthetic left arm, a masterpiece of open-source bioengineering, she'd designed herself after a catastrophic drone accident, gleamed under the harsh desert lights. Where most saw a disability, Sarah had engineered an opportunity. The crowdfunding campaign for her planetary defense concept had been a joke to most. Asteroid redirection, using distributed network of repurposed technology, wasn't exactly a sexy pitch. Government space agencies had laughed. Military contractors had ignored her. But the Internet, that vast, chaotic network of human potential, had listened. Hackers, engineers, retired space program employees, and passionate amateurs had contributed, not just money, but code, designs, and wild ideas. What the Tsel-Negan would soon discover was that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't its technology, but its ability to turn limitations into strengths. As the alien ship began its scan, Sarah activated Protocol Chimera, a system so unconventional it defied traditional military or scientific classification. Retired communication satellites, decommissioned space telescopes, private research platform remnants, and even modified deep-sea communication buoys suddenly came to life. The first indication that something was wrong came when the predictive paradigm shields encountered an unexpected variable. It wasn't an attack. It was something far more dangerous, an impossible combination of redirected momentum, quantum-entangled communication bursts, and pure human improvisation. An asteroid, previously cataloged as a non-threat by every scientific model, began to move. Zornak's first indication of trouble was a minor fluctuation in the ship's quantum stabilization field. Minor, except that in the Tsel-Negan's universe, minor fluctuations did not exist. Every potential outcome was calculated, every variable anticipated. Except this one. The asteroid, now moving with surgical precision, was being guided by a network of systems that shouldn't have been able to communicate, let alone coordinate. Commercial space junk, retired military hardware, private research satellites, all working in a symphony of controlled chaos. Probability matrices are diverging, a junior analyst reported, her voice betraying a hint of panic that would have been unthinkable moments before. Zornak watched in growing horror as their supposedly impenetrable shields began to fracture. Not through brute force, but through a method that defied their most advanced predictive models. It was less an attack and more a total deconstruction of their understanding of warfare, technology, and possibility. When the first communication burst came through, it wasn't a threat. It was almost playful, a combination of mathematical equations, cultural references, and what could only be described as a digital shrug. Commander Zornak's transmission to Central Command was as brief as it was world-changing. "Our models are incorrect." Repeat, "Our models are incorrect." On Earth, in a converted shipping container in the Atacama Desert, Sarah Chen allowed herself a small smile. First contact had just become something entirely unexpected. The universe would never be the same again. The United Nations Special Extraterrestrial Engagement Facility looked nothing like what the Cell Megan expected. Instead of a sleek, technologically advanced complex, it resembled a converted warehouse in downtown New York. Industrial, chaotic, with walls covered in whiteboards filled with diagrams that seemed to follow no logical progression. Elena Rodriguez stood at the center of this controlled chaos, her prosthetic leg gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. The leg itself was a work of art, a custom-built marvel that was part medical device, part engineering experiment. Scars from her Mars mining accident traced lines across her face, each one a testament to survival and adaptation. When the Cell Megan diplomatic delegation arrived, they brought with them centuries of established first contact protocols. What they didn't bring was any capacity to understand the team Elena had assembled. There was Marcus Rice, a street performer whose hands moved with such impossible precision that he could manipulate perception itself. Next to him stood Dr. Hiroshi Nakamura, a quantum physicist whose theories had been repeatedly rejected by mainstream scientific communities. Completing the trio was Colonel Amara Diop, a retired Special Forces operator whose eyes seemed to calculate possibilities faster than any computer. The Cell Megan lead diplomat, Representative Klovex, approached the meeting table with mathematical precision. Their body was a perfect geometric form, crystalline structures that shifted and realigned with each movement, a living representation of their species' dedication to perfect symmetry and predictability. "We are here," Klovex began, their communication translated through a sophisticated quantum entanglement language processor to categorize and understand the potential of the human species. Elena smiled. It was not a welcoming smile. It was the smile of someone about to fundamentally dismantle an entire civilization's understanding of intelligence. Marcus stepped forward first. To the Cell Megan, what happened next defied every known principle of communication. The street performer began a routine that was simultaneously a magic show, a mathematical demonstration, and a psychological experiment. His hands moved, creating illusions that were mathematically impossible. A coin appeared, disappeared, multiplied, not through trickery, but through a demonstration of quantum uncertainty so profound that the Cell Megan translation devices began to malfunction. What should have been a simple sleight of hand became a complex narrative about perception, probability, and the nature of reality itself. Dr. Nakamura followed, but not with a traditional scientific presentation. Instead, he demonstrated quantum principles through an impromptu magic trick that left the Cell Megan delegates completely bewildered. Complex theoretical physics became a performance art, challenging every presumption about how knowledge could be transmitted. Colonel Diop's contribution was perhaps the most devastating. She didn't speak about military strategy. Instead, she demonstrated how human psychological warfare worked, not through violence, but through the manipulation of perception and expectation. "Your models," Elena explained, her voice calm and precise, "are fundamentally limited by your inability to understand complexity as a dynamic emotional system." The Cell Megan translation devices struggled. Emotions weren't data points to be calculated. They were variable systems that could change entire trajectories of interaction. By the end of the meeting, the Cell Megan diplomatic corps was in complete disarray. Their communication algorithms had been systematically dismantled, not through technological superiority, but through a demonstration of human potential that defied every known classificatory system. Representative Klovex's final transmission back to their home world was a series of quantum encrypted signals that, when decoded, essentially translated to, "We do not understand." And that is precisely the point. Elena Rodriguez watched them leave, her prosthetic legs slightly adjusting to compensate for the room's subtle gravitational shifts. Another reminder that adaptation was humanity's true superpower. The diplomatic session was over. But the real communication had just begun. The Cordial invasion fleet arrived with mathematical precision minus 72,843 ships arranged in a perfect fractal formation that represented millennia of strategic optimization. Their battle computers had calculated victory with 87% certainty. What they didn't account for was Commander Jack Harris and the Chaos Doctrine. Harris stood in the underground command center beneath the Cheyenne Mountain Complex, a place that had already witnessed humanity's capacity to survive the impossible. His team was nothing like a traditional military command. Programmers sat alongside former game designers. Quantum theorists worked with street-level intelligence operatives, and at the center of it all was a holographic system that looked more like an immersive video game than a war room. "They're going to expect us to defend," Harris muttered, tracing potential attack vectors with his augmented reality interface. "So we're not going to defend. We're going to turn their precision into a weakness." The first phase of the Chaos Doctrine was information warfare so complex it barely qualified as warfare at all. Instead of securing communication channels, Harris did something unprecedented. He deliberately leaked information, but not just any information. A meticulously crafted series of contradictory, emotionally charged narratives designed to overwhelm the Cordial's computational systems. Social media became a weapon. Conspiracy theories deliberately planted misinformation and strategically released fragments of truth created a psychological minefield that the alien battle computers couldn't process. Each piece of information was a quantum uncertainty, a variable that defied traditional strategic modeling. The Cordial's first wave of attack ran headlong into a defense that wasn't a defense at all. Their ships, designed for perfect mathematical engagement, found themselves navigating a battlefield where the very concept of battlefield had been transformed. Human forces didn't mass in expected defensive positions. Instead, they appeared in locations that were mathematically improbable. A squadron would materialize near a critical Cordial communication hub, not to destroy it, but to broadcast a series of encrypted signals that would take their computational systems weeks to decode. Another human team would infiltrate a Cordial logistics network, not through brute force hacking, but by introducing subtle mathematical anomalies that would cascade through their entire strategic framework. "We're not fighting their war," Harris explained to his team. "We're fighting the war they can't imagine." Quantum-entangled communication buoys, repurposed commercial satellites, and a global network of civilian technology became an impromptu defense system that moved with organic, unpredictable fluidity. Where the Cordial expected solid lines of defense, they found a living, breathing network that could reshape itself instantaneously. The most devastating attack came not from a weapon, but from a series of emotional broadcasts. Human media, with its complex narratives, its capacity for simultaneous tragedy and humor, its ability to transform horror into resilience, became a psychological weapon that the Cordial computational systems simply could not comprehend. Their battle predictions began to fail, not dramatically, but in a series of subtle cascading uncertainties that progressively undermined their entire strategic framework. 72 hours into the invasion, the Cordial found themselves facing an enemy that didn't just resist conquest, an enemy that was fundamentally rewriting the very concept of conflict. And they hadn't fired a single conventional weapon. Commander Jack Harris allowed himself a small smile. Warfare was no longer about destruction. It was about transformation. Dr. Aisha Nyong'o's laboratory looked like a cross between a neuroscience research facility and an art installation. Holographic displays danced with complex neural mapping, while walls were covered with paintings, photographs, and seemingly random collections of human emotional artifacts. The Galactic Research Consortium had sent her their most sophisticated computational linguistics team to solve the problem of human communication. What they didn't realize was that Aisha was about to demonstrate that communication was never just about language, it was about connection. Most species, she explained to the bewildered alien researchers, treat communication as a transmission of information. We see it as the transmission of experience. Her team was a deliberate mosaic of human complexity. A trauma counselor sat next to a quantum physicist. A professional storyteller worked alongside a machine learning expert. A child psychologist collaborated with a diplomatic translator. The resonance protocol wasn't a communication method. It was an entirely new way of understanding interaction. They began by breaking down every known method of alien communication. The Nagan's mathematical language, the Cordial's computational signal matrices, the crystalline frequency communications of the Zarin collective. Each was systematically analyzed not for its efficiency, but for its emotional limitations. Emotions aren't a weakness, Aisha would repeatedly say. They're the most sophisticated computational system in existence. Their first test came during a critical diplomatic negotiation with the Zarin collective, a species that communicated through pure mathematical frequencies. Instead of presenting arguments, Aisha's team presented stories. Not just any stories. Narratives that were simultaneously personal and universal. A story about a Mars mining accident became a complex exploration of human resilience. A tale of a child's recovery from illness transformed into a nuanced discussion about adaptive systems. The Zarin communication matrices began to shift. For the first time, they weren't receiving information. They were experiencing context. The breakthrough came when they realized that human empathy wasn't just an emotional response. It was a computational method of processing complexity that no alien system had ever conceived. Each story contained multiple layers of meaning. Mathematical precision intersected with emotional depth. A simple narrative about a family's survival during an ecological crisis became a sophisticated exploration of systemic adaptation, resource management, and collective resilience. The alien researchers watched in growing astonishment as these human narratives did something impossible. They created communication channels that transcended traditional informational transfer. Aisha's team had weaponized storytelling. By the negotiation's end, the Zarin delegation was fundamentally changed. They hadn't just received information. They had experienced a new way of understanding existence. We don't just communicate, Aisha told her team as they celebrated their success. We transform. The resonance protocol was more than a diplomatic technique. It was a fundamental reimagining of how intelligence could interact with itself. Humanity's greatest weapon wasn't technology. It was understanding. The research facility looked like organized madness. Located in an abandoned particle accelerator complex in the Swiss Alps, it brought together the most unlikely collection of minds humanity could assemble. Dr. Elena Rosario, a theoretical physicist with a history of being spectacularly wrong and occasionally brilliant, stood at the center of this organized chaos. Surrounding her was a team that defied every conventional approach to scientific research. Marcus Chen, a recovering drug addict turned quantum computing specialist. Olivia Rodriguez, a retired circus performer with an uncanny understanding of spatial dynamics. Dr. Hiroshi Nakamura, the quantum physicist perpetually on the edge of scientific acceptance. And James Wellington, a chef whose understanding of complex systems rivaled any computational expert. Their mission: solve faster-than-light communication. Their approach: completely ignore every established scientific method. We're not trying to solve a problem, Elena would say. We're trying to understand why it's a problem in the first place. The breakthrough came not from sophisticated mathematical models, but from a combination of intuition, creative thinking, and what could only be described as controlled accidents. Marcus's background in recovering from addiction gave him a unique perspective on systemic transformation. He understood that complex systems weren't about rigid control, but about adaptive flexibility. Olivia's circus training meant she understood balance, momentum, and the delicate interaction of seemingly unrelated forces. Their first prototype looked less like a scientific instrument and more like a performance art installation. Quantum entanglement modules were suspended like trapeze wires. Computational matrices were arranged with the precision of a circus rigging system. Holographic displays danced with probabilistic calculations that seemed to defy traditional physics. The key insight came during what should have been a complete failure. While testing a quantum communication prototype, Marcus accidentally spilled coffee on the primary computational matrix. Instead of destroying the experiment, the liquid's thermal and molecular interactions created an unexpected quantum resonance. What if, James suggested, looking at the spilled coffee and complex mathematical displays, we're not trying to send information. We're trying to send experience. They introduced what they called emotional noise into quantum entanglement systems, not as a distraction, but as a fundamental communication parameter. The quantum particles began to behave in ways that violated every known principle of physics. Information wasn't just transmitted, it was experienced. The scientific community was initially skeptical. How could a team that included a recovering addict, a circus performer, a perpetually marginalized physicist, and a chef possibly create a breakthrough in quantum communication? But when they demonstrated the first successful faster-than-light communication, the impossible became real. The transmission wasn't just data. It was a complete experiential package. Mathematical precision intertwined with emotional context. A communication that wasn't just received, but fundamentally understood. Alien scientific teams were stunned. This wasn't just a technological breakthrough. It was a fundamental reimagining of communication itself. We didn't solve the problem of faster-than-light communication, Elena told the assembled researchers. We transformed the very concept of communication. The universe would never be the same again. Commander Zornak's psychological recalibration chamber was unlike anything in Selnagan medical history. Where traditional realignment processes involved perfect mathematical restructuring, this experiment was pure human-inspired chaos. The chamber itself was a marvel of technological and psychological engineering. Holographic interfaces danced with probabilistic projections. Quantum neural networks intertwined with emotional mapping systems. This was no ordinary medical procedure. This was an existential transformation. Zornak had volunteered, or perhaps been compelled, to undergo a radical process of understanding. That Selnagan had watched humanity dismantle every known principle of prediction, communication, and strategic engagement. Now, they would attempt to understand why. The human psychologists who designed the recalibration process were themselves a study in controlled unpredictability. Dr. Maya Santos, a neuropsychologist with a background in performance art. Dr. Kenji Yoshida, a computational linguist who had spent years studying improvisational theater. And Dr. Marcus Rodriguez, a quantum consciousness researcher who believed that the most important scientific discoveries happened in the spaces between known systems. We're not trying to remake you, Maya explained to Zornak. We're trying to help you understand the value of uncertainty. The process began with what could only be described as controlled cognitive disruption. Traditional Selnagan neural pathways, which had been mathematically optimized over millennia, were systematically challenged. Instead of presenting logical problems to solve, the team introduced scenarios of pure emotional complexity. They showed Zornak art that defied mathematical interpretation, paintings that changed meaning based on the viewer's emotional state, musical compositions that were simultaneously mathematical equations and emotional expressions, poems that existed in multiple interpretative states simultaneously. Dr. Yoshida introduced improvisation exercises that completely dismantled Zornak's understanding of communication, where the Selnagan saw language as a precise transmission of information. These exercises demonstrated communication as a living, breathing system of mutual creation. Predict this, Kenji would say, introducing scenarios that were simultaneously serious and absurd. A diplomatic negotiation that could transform into a dance performance, a mathematical proof that could become a love story. Zornak's neural matrices began to shift, not through forceful reprogramming, but through a process of gentle, persistent exposure to complexity. The breakthrough came during what seemed like a complete failure. After weeks of intensive recalibration, Zornak experienced what the human team called an emotional breakthrough, a moment of pure, unbridled uncertainty that was simultaneously terrifying and transformative. For the first time in their existence, Zornak understood that the most powerful predictive system wasn't one that eliminated uncertainty, but one that could dance with it. Their final assessment was both a scientific report and a work of art. Mathematical precision intersected with emotional depth. Probabilistic projections danced with personal narrative. It was a document that couldn't be classified, couldn't be reduced to a simple data point. Uncertainty, Zornak wrote in the conclusion, is not a problem to be solved. It is a system to be experienced. The Selnagan scientific community was stunned. This wasn't just a psychological experiment. It was a fundamental reimagining of intelligence itself. Zornak had entered the recalibration chamber as a representative of a perfectly predictive civilization. They emerged as something entirely new. The transformation was subtle at first. Like a quantum wave propagating through an interconnected system, humanity's influence began to reshape galactic civilization in ways no one could have predicted. On the crystalline world of Zarin Prime, the first signs emerged in their educational systems. Where once learning had been a precise, mathematically optimized process, schools began introducing what they called human adaptive thinking modules. Students were no longer just consuming information. They were learning to experience knowledge as a dynamic, living system. The cordial military academies were the next to change. Strategic planning began to incorporate emotional intelligence alongside computational modeling. Officers were trained not just in tactical execution, but in understanding the psychological complexity of conflict. They studied human case studies, not as curiosities, but as fundamental reimaginings of strategic engagement. Economic systems across multiple star systems began to evolve. The rigid, efficiency-driven models that had dominated galactic commerce for millennia started to incorporate human-inspired concepts of individual potential, creative disruption, and systemic flexibility. On the trading hub of Nexus Station, a Selnagan economic analyst named Privex developed what became known as the uncertainty principle of market dynamics. Instead of trying to eliminate market variables, the new economic model embraced them. Investments were no longer just about predictable returns, but about potential for transformative innovation. Diplomatic protocols transformed. Where once first contact meant rigid classification and controlled interaction, it now became a process of mutual exploration. The human approach of emotional intelligence and adaptive communication spread like a sophisticated virus through galactic interaction systems. The most profound changes happened in technological development. Research became less about linear progression and more about creative exploration. The rigid separation between scientific disciplines began to break down. Quantum physicists worked alongside artists. Computational experts collaborated with emotional intelligence specialists. A joint research project between human scientists and the Zarin Collective resulted in a breakthrough in adaptive computing that revolutionized artificial intelligence. The new systems weren't just responsive, they were capable of emotional learning, of understanding context beyond pure data points. Cultural exchange programs became something entirely new. No longer were they about simple information transfer. They became immersive experiences of mutual transformation. A cordial diplomat might spend a year living with a human family, not to gather intelligence, but to truly understand a different way of experiencing existence. The changes weren't always smooth. There was resistance. Traditional systems fought against this new way of thinking. But the human-inspired approach proved too powerful, too adaptive to be completely resisted. Elena Rodriguez, now heading the Galactic Cultural Integration Initiative, watched these changes with a mixture of amazement and understanding. "We're not conquering," she would often say. "We're connecting." The universe was discovering that intelligence was not about perfect prediction. It was about the capacity to transform, to experience, to connect in ways that defied mathematical certainty. Humanity had not just changed the game. They had reimagined the very concept of the game itself. And they were just getting started. The quantum extinction event was something no civilization had ever survived. A cascading breakdown of fundamental physical laws that would systematically erase entire star systems, computational matrices, and the very fabric of galactic existence. Every advanced civilization's predictive models showed the same terrifying conclusion. Total annihilation was 99.99999% certain. The meeting that would determine the fate of galactic civilization took place on a modified space station that was itself a testament to human-inspired design. Where traditional meeting spaces were rigid and mathematically perfect, this one was a living, breathing system of adaptive architecture. Elena Rodriguez sat at the center of a diverse team that defied every conventional approach to problem-solving. Dr. Aisha Nyong'o, the emotional intelligence specialist. Commander Jack Harris, the strategic adaptation expert. Marcus Chen, the quantum computational maverick. And Zornak, the transformed cell-Negan analyst who had become a bridge between mathematical precision and human creativity. "We're not going to solve this," Elena explained to the assembled galactic representatives. "We're going to transform it." Where every other civilization saw an extinction event, they saw a complex system waiting to be understood. The breakthrough came not from advanced technology, but from a fundamental reimagining of the problem itself. Instead of trying to prevent the quantum extinction event, they began to understand it as a transformative process rather than a destructive one. Marcus Chen's quantum computational models began to dance with Zornak's probabilistic analysis. Aisha Nyong'o introduced emotional mapping that treated the fundamental physical breakdown as a living system rather than a mathematical problem. Jack Harris approached the challenge like a complex strategic engagement, looking for systemic vulnerabilities that could be transformed rather than destroyed. Their solution was so elegant, so profoundly simple, that it left the other galactic civilizations stunned. They didn't stop the quantum extinction event. They changed its fundamental nature. By introducing what they called adaptive resonance into the fundamental physical systems, they transformed a destructive cascade into a regenerative process. Star systems didn't die. They were reborn. Computational matrices didn't collapse. They evolved. The universe itself seemed to respond to this fundamentally human approach. This capacity to see beyond the immediate, to understand complexity as a living, breathing system of infinite potential. When the event reached its predicted point of total annihilation, something miraculous happened. Instead of destruction, there was transformation. Entire star systems reorganized, physical laws recalibrated. The very fabric of existence demonstrated a flexibility that no predictive model had ever anticipated. "We didn't save the universe," Elena told the stunned representatives. "We helped it discover its own potential." The gathered civilizations realized something profound. Humanity's greatest contribution wasn't technological. It was a way of understanding existence itself as a dynamic, adaptive, infinitely complex system of potential. Zornak, looking at the transformed galactic landscape, understood now what humanity had been trying to demonstrate from the very beginning. The most powerful computational system isn't one that predicts. It's one that can imagine.